live connection. Now I'm not sure why it says starting live connection, but it's taking longer. It's the iPad that I was using to connect, which I suppose now is supposed to be connecting. I'm not sure normal on your side where you born any connection. It's supposed to be connecting because on my side it's live, but I'm not sure on the we check out on a different line, not the one I'm talking to. Okay. On my side it has gone live. I'm not sure if sure, because angiboni ukuthi le right nasiyeke leyo ukodini bazongilinka bona. Mina ngifuna ufonela ukodini manje ngimcheck ukuthi ngi-live yini because lo yi-one esidepende kuyena angiboni ukuthi nayo uyabona ngoba lapha ngibona ama-signs of I'm using the phone manje kodwa I'm not sure noma I'm appearing live yini ngoba ngibona on my side i-live kodwa and ngibona abantu abalokhu befaka like I'm not sure whether no on the ANC account. And now to Zamandlondo now somebody is watching Ketso Terence. Yeah. Well, yeah. Hello? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, activists and cadres of our movement. Let me also convey a special greeting and salutation to the SASCO leadership of Khulekani Mhlongo branch at the University of Zululand, Kwadlangezwa campus, for having initiated this process that we should be able to have an interaction about the life and the times of our beloved Chris Hani, the outstanding son of our movement. And of course, I must also indicate to the many viewers, my friends, comrades, and many others who have taken time off and have an opportunity to interact with the presentation that I've been requested to make, and say to all of them, good afternoon, good evening, and happy lockdown day. The branch that has requested me to participate in this interaction is a branch that is named after Comrade Khulekani Mhlongo, the late Khulekani Mhlongo, the former SRC president of the same university, as well as the former deputy regional secretary of the ANC in the then North Coast region and now called Musadlaza region. So thank you very much, comrades, and I also want to convey the same appreciation to the national leadership of SASCO, the Deputy Secretary General, Comrade Vezintlantla, who also lended a hand to support the branch in communicating with myself that I should be part of this evening engagement. Of course, as all of us know, today marks the 27 years since the departure of one of the outstanding revolutionaries produced by the struggling people of our country, the continent and the rest of the world, Comrade Chris Hani. However, as we all know, due to conditions beyond our control, and indeed for the first time since our beloved Chris Hani departed this world, we will not be able to gather together in numbers in our community halls, various stadiums and other areas that we usually do in order to reflect on his life, the times and the contribution that he made in pursuit of the National Democratic Revolution. And of course, this explains the time and the space in which we find ourselves as humanity in general. And of course, we too, as part of that humanity of the world, South Africans are confronted by what has appeared to be, of course, a formidable and an invisible enemy, which has sharply redefined the way and the manner in which we relate and socialize. And I think these are some of one of the reasons, particularly that's the fundamental reason why it was impossible for us to converge in any community hall or in any school or place of gathering in order to reflect and share experience, share views and opinions, perspectives about what we believe was represented by Comrade Khulekani. The emergence, of course, of the deadly disease defined as coronavirus and popularly known as COVID-19 has undoubtedly placed humanity across all political, ideological, and geographical classification at what one may define as an unprecedented pedestal, a new situation, a new environment which we have never been to, and of course, and I think all of us must be very proud that we are South Africans, first and foremost, and of course, additionally to those of us who are members of the ANC, that the world and humanity has had to confront this challenge during a period where our people, the great masses of South Africa, are led by, and the government is led by the African National Congress under the able leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa, who, as we all have seen, reflected a sterling quality of leadership and concrete appreciation of the immediate task of our time, which is, of course, to defend human life. And I think the way in which the President and our government have actually responded to this difficult situation have to a very larger extent convinced not only supporters of the ANC but South Africans and the rest of our people that indeed they were not wrong in supporting the election of the African National Congress and President Cyril Ramaphosa as the leader of our people during this difficult period. I believe that most of us are acutely aware of the devastating effect of the disease that the disease has had in many parts of the world, particularly within the European countries, and of course, as we would have seen over the past few weeks up until today, a very significant rise of the impact of the disease in terms of those who are infected and affected within the United States of America. And surely I think it's a matter that all of us are deeply concerned and worried about. And we're only privileged that as part of this country, we are witnessing a leadership that is agile, hands-on, focused, and addressing issues that are facing our people in the best interest of the National Democratic Revolution. It is perfectly obvious and unambiguously clear to the naked eyes that unless drastic measures were undertaken, including the initial and subsequently extended lockdown, South Africa and South Africans could have been one of the grave victims of the pandemic. And I think that many of our people who probably felt that they were inconvenienced, were deeply concerned about the level of inconvenience, the difficulty to adapt to the new situation and a new condition that is unprecedented, will one day, I believe, be grateful to the fact that the disease, because of our leadership, the leadership of our country, would not be able to make a drastic impact into the lives of our people, except to the extent that, of course, as we have been reported yesterday by the Minister of Health and today We've lost some of our compatriots and patriots as a consequence of being infected by the disease. So I think that all of us should indeed support the effort of our government, and we should ensure that we respond to all of the instructions that have been given to us in the best way we could, in the best way we can, in order to ensure that we save lives. Of course, I must indicate that as many of you, the viewers of this conversation, are familiar with, that history is replete with examples of many, is replete with many examples of how humanity has had to contend and engage in a titanic battle with what would have been defined, as we do today, as devastating disease, which in terms of, as I went through the historical records, I discovered that something that I'm sure many of you have seen, that the first time that the disease of this nature, the first time that a disease of this nature had actually happened, first time that the disease of this nature had actually happened, was precisely during the period of the 1720. A disease that was called the plague, that had became a difficulty for humanity to deal with. And on the second occasion, a century later, in 1820, there was also a cholera outbreak, which indeed as well costed many lives and became a major challenge to humanity and the rest of those who are having a responsibility to respond to the immediate challenges of defending our people against all difficulties and challenges which are threatening the very survival of humanity. In the third occasion, a century later again in 1920, we then had to experience what was called the Spanish flu, which costed many lives, and indeed I think many of our people were also very concerned that aren't we be facing with the same situation today with the coronavirus. And clearly the world at that time also, evidence is quite extensive. The evidence is quite extensive in terms of how the world responded to that situation and dealt with what was obviously a threat to the survival of humanity. And I think we must therefore understand that what we are confronted with today, again 100 years later, in 2020, the coronavirus, is a similar challenge that humanity has overcome before. And that it is important that as we deal with it, we understand that we are not dealing with a problem that is occurring for the first time. We are dealing with a problem that has actually changed its character and changed its definition, but in essence, it remains a challenge to humanity, and it remains a disease that our people would have to work together to comply with everything that government had said we must do and needed to be done in order to achieve a decisive breakthrough in the defeat of this current disease. However, in all of these instances, of course, despite massive loss of lives, people succeeded and prevailed, primarily because as a people who are older than any problems and challenges. And I think this is a point that has to be emphasized. There are instances that at times when our people are overwhelmed by complex challenges, by difficulties, by what appears to be an unprecedented difficulty, that some of our people will surrender to it and become disillusioned, despair and lose hope. And I think the central message that has been articulated by the president of our country, President Cyril Ramaphosa, and all our leaders across political spectrum, is the fact that as humanity, as human beings, who have been into this situation, this kind of a situation before, and we've had to deal with it. And because of our unity, because of our ability to respect the instructions of those who are governing and those who understand the nature of the problem, the source of the problem, and the precautionary measures that all of us must undertake in order to defend ourselves. They have said that we will, and I believe that I'm one of those who are very convinced that this is one moment where we cannot and we should not lose hope. We cannot and we should not give up. We have to wage a battle, and we have to wage the war, and we will emerge victorious ultimately. Therefore, I want to say that, of course, as I said, it's inevitable that humanity will once again triumph over this current pandemic, even though, like in any other war, we should expect that there will be casualties. Casualties are completely not avoidable. Therefore, it is incumbent upon all of us, as South Africans in general, and activists and cadres of our movement in particular, those of us who belong to the African National Congress and the National Liberation Movement, that we must occupy the frontline battle. We must assume the strategic responsibility of providing leadership, to work with our people, to inspire hope, to ensure that the message of our government and scientists across the world who have said that there are certain things that we need to do and there are certain things that we need to avoid, is not only respected, but is completely and entirely adhered to by all our people. So I think that that's fundamentally important for us who regard themselves as activists of the National Democratic Revolution, and of course, the midwives of social transformation in our country. We have that specific responsibility, and we have to make a special effort. We have to make a special effort to ensure that all our people understand, internalize the message, respect and act on the basis of the understanding of what is required of them in order for us together to ensure that we defeat the pandemic. It's going to be very important. I'm quite certain that all of us are immensely proud of the sterling work done by our fearless men and women, patriotic medical professionals, the health caregivers, the arm of our country, South African Defence Force and the police. And I think the sterling job that they've done, we have to congratulate them. Of course, there is a saying that says we shouldn't congratulate or praise the fish for swimming. But we should also accept that under the conditions we find ourselves, it takes an extraordinary effort and courage, for the men and women of our country, the professional health workers, the caregivers, the army and the police, who are ensuring that the country is safe, the citizens are protected, and that those that are not yet infected, precautionary measures are taken to ensure that they do not get infected, and those that are infected are taken care of, provided with the medication, and supported in order to overcome the disease. And I'm very happy that, and I think many of us as South Africans are very proud of the fact that as much as we've had casualties and fatalities, but we've also seen quite a steady rise on the number of those who are emerging as having defeated and overcome the pandemic, which is quite heartening and quite interesting and very, very important for us to ensure that we build on those successes. I'm saying that because we must avoid being disillusioned or overwhelmed by the magnitude and the nature of this problem. It is during this moment that society will know whether or not the movement and its leadership is fit for purpose. And I think there are not many occasions, there are not many moments or many occasions in society that a leadership of that time will be tested in terms of whether or not that leadership is fit for purpose. And I think that what we are seeing across the board, from our government, from the military, the police, the health professional care workers, and all our people who have decided to ensure that all hands must be on deck, is an expression of quality of leadership that is existing across different facets of our country and society. which has made it possible for the nation to unite and to respond with a concrete and coherent message about what needs and needed to be done to ensure that we remain safe, and that as a people we would not be a serious victim of the challenge that we're facing. So I'm very, very optimistic. I think the demonstration of leadership over the past few weeks has, to a very large extent, sent a very convincing message about the extent to which the leadership is fit for purpose in terms of addressing the challenges that confront our people. Let me therefore join the apex leadership of our movement, both at a level of provinces, our province in KZN, and the national leadership, and also echo the same message that the President has consistently conveyed to our people, that please stay at home, constantly wash your hands with water and soap, make use of the hand sanitizer where possible, protect others and protect yourselves. And I think it's going to be important that the centrality of protection, because we come from a society where, particularly, as South Africans, we have always understood the essence and the importance of solidarity. And we have always understood that it is fundamentally important that we must endeavor to protect other people in order to have ourselves protected. And I think the message that has to be going out very frequently and very, very strong is a message that says each one of us has a fundamental responsibility to protect the next person, as a consequence of which will also be protected. And I think if we don't get that message lost, we will then succeed to ensure that many of our people are protected from the pandemic, and that we succeed in our effort to defeat the pandemic, consistent with the message of our government and the message of the health professionals who have done a great deal of work to protect our people. And the emphasis, in my view, is that we must first and foremost protect others so that we get protected. This approach must be underpinned by an acute understanding that COVID-19 pandemic exists and it kills. We can draw some lessons from of course, and I think that's one of the things that as we deal with this issue, we must draw some lessons from what we've seen happening in other parts of the world, in Italy, in Spain, and recently in the US, and of course, the Chinese and the Chinese government, the CPC, the Communist Party of China, the way in which the leadership in that country responded to the pandemic was, I think, very, very, very encouraging, very, very, giving hope that this thing is not going to be, it's not going to go anywhere closer a possibility of wiping out humanity. And I think we should celebrate that. So I'm quite certain that all of us are deeply concerned about, of course, the social and economic impact of the lockdown, which the President has consistently addressed. However, I also believe that all of us would agree that nothing can take precedence over the protection of life. So to close our borders, to slow down in many things that we usually do as people, and to only focus on what is called essential services, suffices for us to ensure that we protect the lives of our people and we protect our country and its future. Let me also emphasize, the emphasis in my view about the importance of protecting life is that we should first and foremost, as I said, protect others for us to be protected. This approach is also underpinned by an acute understanding that the COVID-19 will and can be defeated. Let me also draw some lesson from a closer expression used by President Thabo Mbeki during the period when our country was mourning the departure of President Nelson Mandela. This closer expression that was used by President Mbeki, which I'm sure that many of our people would have seen, would have heard it being used. It says, and I quote, ewe lento kakade yinto yalonto, which can simply be translated to mean what it is and cannot be avoided. unquote. We must work together to defeat the dangerous mentality that people believe themselves to be protected and care less about the protection of others. This constitutes a direct and a blatant betrayal of what Comrade Chrysan and his generation represented and stood for, and for which they were prepared to die, and many of them indeed die for that important obligation. I believe that, of course, let me now return to my primary mandate for this interaction arising from the request from the leadership of SASCO at the University of Zululand, as I referred to earlier on. Indeed, all progressive forces within and outside the borders of our country have today accordingly and correctly taken time to remember and reflect on the times and the lives of the outstanding leader of our people, our beloved Chrysan. In our case, we have been requested to reflect on the life of Comrade Chrysan in the context of the attainment of free, compulsory and free education, as well as free quality health care for all our people. I believe that the topic has been framed in this way. On one hand, owing to the fact that SASCO is a student movement or a student organization, and therefore always genuinely concerned about the direction and the quality of knowledge imparted to their constituents, who are the students. On the other hand, and I think that the existence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the capacity of our health system to adequately respond to this difficult challenge has also necessitated that a discussion about the life of Comrade Chrysan deliberately combines the importance and the essence of education as well as the health care of our country. Let me therefore hasten to say that Comrade Martin Tembisile Hani was the Chief of Staff of our glorious army, Umkhonto weSizwe, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, South African Communist Party, and of course, a member of the ANC National Executive Committee and the National Working Committee. His ascendance to the leadership position in all of these structures was truly a mark of the quality of a human being, the freedom fighter, the leader of the oppressed people of our country, an internationalist, and a committed revolutionary. And of course, for some of us, the younger generation, who could not have an opportunity because of by virtue of our age, to work with Comrade Chris, to be exposed to his leadership, his ability, to practically learn from him. The name Chrysan conjures up certain images that of course may be also images that are accepted by those who have worked with him, but equally for us who did not work with him because of our age, but a younger generation have learned and internalized, having followed what he had said in public and also read about him. One of the things that the name Chrysan conjures up, one of the images, is that of a courageous revolutionary and the bravest soldier of our liberation struggle. He was a convinced Marxist-Leninist, and that you can see from one of the quotations that I think many of us are very familiar with, where he clarified in the simplest way I've ever heard the true meaning of socialism, where he said that socialism is about water, it's about providing decent shelter, it's about safe drinking water, it's about quality healthy care, it's about the dignity of the old, it's about everything that ensures that a human being or people succeed in pursuit of their own objectives. And I think for me that is really a stage of a human being, that is a caliber of a leader that we are reflecting on. He led and supervised MK soldiers during the most difficult period in the history of our country and the struggle for liberation. And I think that on its own, the fact that he was chosen by the apex leadership of our movement to assume that responsibility at such a critical moment in our struggle reflect the quality of the human being, his commitment, his ability to work with the collective, and his determination to fight for the freedom of our people, irrespective of what it takes. And of course, I must also indicate that he obviously having been born, but he was a constructed revolutionary. He was not just born, but he was constructed, and he was a product of his circumstances and the experience and the people's experiences that he lives among. I'm saying this because every human being is born, but revolutionaries are constructed. They are developed, they are nurtured, they are a product of their own circumstances. They rise within a particular context and affirm themselves, their presence and their impact as revolutionaries who will then be honored by history when they are no longer with us. And I think Comrade Khulekani is part of the crop of our leadership, the crop of our cadres who have displayed outstanding revolutionary commitment and dedication to the cause of our people. He obviously had what one can define as the tenacity to climb the tallest tree. A few weeks ago, or a few months ago, we had an opportunity as the ANC Provincial Executive Committee in the province in KwaZulu-Natal to reflect on what is it that needs to be done for us to attain the all-important task of the renewal of our movement. And one of the things that we said was that it's fundamentally important, very, very important, that revolutionaries must be beyond reproach. Revolutionaries must endeavor to do what we call climbing the highest tree. They must be above everything. They must act in a way that does not only provide convincing leadership to society, but also inspires the nation to follow them. And I think, Comrade Khulekani, history is littered with examples of how, at critical moments within our movement, in the army, he emerged as one of those outstanding cadres of our people, highly determined and highly committed to ensure that the National Democratic Revolution succeed. So when we celebrate Comrade Khulekani, the intention is not merely to converge and say all these beautiful words about him, but is to immortalize the attributes of the best among us in the movement, and to preserve them for us and for future generations to emulate. So it's important that we do not make it a ritual, that every year we would meet to reflect about the best amongst us, Comrade Oliver Tambo, President Tambo, President Mandela, and today, as I said, as we reflect on Khulekani, the fundamental task is that what is it that we emulate, that we draw out of that experience? What is it that we can say, having understood and learned about what Khulekani represented? What are the things that I will endeavor to do from now going forward in an effort to ensure that I contribute in a process of immortalizing the greatness that a cadre of our movement represented. And I think that is quite important. It must help us to inspire, these celebrations must help us to inspire the greatness amongst us. And I'm certain that we must honor Khulekani by remaining loyal and committed to the ideals of the National Democratic Revolution, which, as we all know and are all familiar, is the creation of a united, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and a prosperous society. This is essentially what Khulekani stood for, and this is what, if we were to claim to represent anything that was closer to him, we must ensure that we remain committed to. I'm saying this because it is perfectly obvious that this objective is impossible without consciously producing leaders. These objectives of advancing the NDR, representing what Khulekani stood for, I'm saying that it is perfectly obvious that it will be impossible without consciously producing leaders and cadres who are steeped in the revolutionary theory, who are educated and wholeheartedly serve the cause of our people. It is in this context that the question of free, compulsory, and quality education therefore remains a central task. It is a well-known fact that since 1994, a great deal of work has been done to ensure that many of our people who were deprived, who were marginalized, have access to higher education in particular. However, and I think this is a concern that is shared by all of us, that to significantly improve access has also been a fundamental challenge due to the imbalances of the past and, of course, the constraint in terms of the resources available to the democratic state. What really brings about the challenge around the constraint in terms of resources is the fact that there are competing demands. We have to take care of the health system, the infrastructure, roads, building schools, social reliefs. Many of our people are unemployed and depend on social grants or social reliefs, intervention. Now, all of those issues, all of those obligations on the state, all of those are taking money from the same pot that must still be used to finance education. And I think it is in this context that we must understand, whenever there are difficulties, for the democratic state to live up to the commitment that it aspires to. But it must also not suggest that therefore we have no right to dream, we have no right to plan, we have no right to have a clear articulated intention that we wish to pursue. The constraint will come as part of the challenges that we'll always confront in our way. And I think another challenge that is obviously has been and remains a stark reality for us to confront is a transformation of our higher education system in order to meet what we call contemporary, national and global economic demands and, of course, the needs of our people. I'm convinced that we are all of the same mind, that education is central to the development of both an individual and society. Without a society of educated people, we cannot advance in our development. And I think it's important to emphasize that without a society of educated people, it is impossible for us to advance in our development. And of course, as we engage and interact, and I have observed that many of our people, our comrades, my friends on Facebook and those who are friends to the NC account are making comments, reflecting as well, which is quite correct. And I must indicate that at some point later on, when I'm done with the brief presentation that I want to go through, I will also take time to respond to each and every comment that would have come across. But I want to say that, and I want to emphasize what I said earlier on, that without a society of educated people, we cannot advance the development of our country. And therefore, there is no rational person can deny the fact that unless there is access to quality education, development will also remain a distant dream. Perhaps at this stage, and of course, despite sustained weaknesses, we should applaud the decision of our government, the democratic state, for having taken a giant step to introduce measures towards a realization of free higher education in our country. And I'm talking about the introduction of measures towards that because we have not yet attained free education in South Africa. But there are progressive interventions flowing from the work done a few years ago and the announcement made by former President Zuma in 2017. There are positive developments that we can see and that we have seen and continue to see towards the direction of ensuring that we realize the strategic objective of free quality education for all our people, particularly the poor and the downtrodden in our country. This is obviously consistent with the objectives that are contained in the Freedom Charter, which remains our North Star. It remains a document that determines the nature of society we want to build and how we must act as a people to ensure that we build a better life for all. The Freedom Charter, among other things, says the doors of learning and culture shall be open. And the intention of introducing progressive measures towards the realization of free education is a response to that objective. Because unless you do something that ensures that many of our people have access to higher education, the Freedom Charter, that clause of the Freedom Charter will then remain a pipe dream and meaningless to many of our people. But I must also say that the quality of education that has to be constantly and consistently improved to meet the ever-changing demands of our time. So it's important to understand that we must heighten and enhance access, but there must also a sustained effort of our academics, our universities, and of course with a direct involvement and central participation of the student leadership in a transformation of the education sector itself, the content that is delivered to our students, the skills that they are bequeathed as a consequence of being in tertiary institutions. Let me therefore borrow from the book that is titled Towards an African Identity on Higher Education, written by Professors Makgoba as well as Professor Siepa. That book makes a compelling argument about higher education in our country. It argues, and I want to quote, firstly, that universities are better placed, primed to advance, generate, and disseminate knowledge for systemic intervention in society. Secondly, that because of this privileged position, society looks to universities to provide understanding and solution to critical questions of the day. And probably before I go to the third quotation, let me just say something about the second one. I think part of what the student leadership, of course led by the progressive SASCO, must continuously engage on at the university level is to respond to this question about ensuring that universities are producing solutions that are critical to the questions of the day. It's fundamentally important because if universities are unable to do that, we will then be confronted by another reality, a difficult situation where we've got too many graduates, as to some extent we do have now, but who do not possess the skills that is required by the imperatives of our economy, the skills that is required by the ever-changing modern world, which requires that our people must also adapt and continuously be skilled in order to meet the demands of our time. The third issue that the professors have made mention of is that embedded in this privilege is an unwritten accord or social contract between universities and society in which they are located. And I think that is a very fundamental point. Besides the fact that a university or a TVET college exists and is located in a particular community, in a particular specific community. For instance, if I were to take the University of Zululand, KwaDlangezwe campus, which is right at the township of KwaDlangezwe, what is it that the university does? What advantage does the community of KwaDlangezwe has as a consequence of having within their own neighborhood a university? I'm raising this question because in my own view, it is not sufficient. It can never be enough. That what makes it an advantage is the proximity in terms of the students being able to traverse or to commute between their homes and the university. If we agree, and I think many of us will agree with the fact that universities are centers of knowledge, and knowledge production and reproduction, the key question will be, to what extent does the knowledge produced by our institutions of higher learning, both colleges, TVET colleges as well as universities, is able to provide solutions to the communities where they are located? Of course, that does not mean that we are localizing the production of knowledge and therefore disengaging these institutions of learning, of higher learning, from the national, continental, and global competition and global contribution to the knowledge production and knowledge development. That is not the case. But the question would be, in my own view, you can't be excellent or be seen to be excellent at a national, continental, and international level, and yet the society within which you are located cannot identify practically with the contribution that we are making to their day-to-day lives. And I think that is a question that the location of the university and the society within which they are located has to be interrogated. The fourth point made by the professors, which I also want to quote, is that universities are really about discord. Within universities, there are no eternal truths. And I think that is quite important to understand that in the context of a university, there is an expectation that there is an ongoing inquiry and an understanding that what may be true today will not be true tomorrow. And that is why the concept of internal truth does not exist at the level of the university, because ideas and opinions, studies and findings are constantly subjected to further interrogation, which is part of an ongoing task that universities and TVET colleges must undertake in order to ensure that the societies within which they are located live up to the demands and the expectations of the global economy, a global society within this kind of a globalizing world. The last one is that, of course, indeed, Professors Makhoba and Siepa have said that indeed the business of university is sustained by disagreements, debates, the unfinished and unanswered questions of the time, which of course is related to the earlier point that I made. I remember when I was still at the university, there were instances where, as we interact with our counterpart from Wits University, University of Cape Town and other institutions, there was this notion that certain universities had reached a level of excellence. And that notion, of course, was underpinned by the recognition of the output they make, both in terms of postgraduate at a level of PhD and masters, but equally in terms of the knowledge production which emerges out of those universities. But the fundamental issue is that we cannot and we should not reach a stage as an institution of higher learning where we say we are now have reached a high level of excellence, because there must be a continuous inquiry, there must be a continuous engagement with existing forms of knowledge in an endeavor to ensure that as a country and as a people, we do not only make a substantive and substantial contribution to knowledge development in our continent, but also that we become a global player that will be respected across the globe in terms of the quality and the essence of knowledge that we espouse and the research output that is taking place in our own country. And of course, I must also say that in our own time, the question that must therefore arise is to what extent have our universities and TVET colleges modeled themselves consistent with these expectations which I've outlined above, as articulated in the book that I referred to, written by Professors Makhoba and Siepe. I'm saying this point because the question of social contract between the university and the society somehow, and I think the student leadership, is a question that we used to immerse ourselves on when we were still at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. What is the understanding of the university community, both in terms of the academia, the management and the staff, of an unwritten social contract that they as a university have with the society? And to what extent are they willing and able to live up to the expectation that society has about those who, by virtue of their location and responsibility embedded on them, are expected to produce knowledge and help society to answer to current and historical questions as part of an evolving society and the world? Well, of course, I guess the answer to this question would be both affirmative and negative in terms of whether universities are recognizing that responsibility. It is therefore perfectly obvious that the balance between the two would explain the quality of graduates emerging from our higher education institution. So I'm saying that whether or not universities are living up to this responsibility, to some extent the answer may be say yes, but to a greater extent the answer is also no. And I'm saying the balance between the yes or no, the balance between the two, is what we must understand explains the quality of our graduates, which are emerging from universities and TVET colleges within our country. And that is a balance that must be further interrogated by intellectuals in our country, the academia, and those, as I said, who are responsible and are the midwives of knowledge production and reproduction in our country. A few years ago, and of course, as I said earlier on, a few years ago, our movement decided that education and health were made to be key national priorities. And this is also evidenced by the budget allocated to the two relevant departments. And I think this is happening at the national level as well as in provinces. When the ANC decided that education and health must be apex priorities, what had fundamentally underpinned that objective is a recognition on the part of the movement that if you were to succeed in having a healthy and an educated nation, you'll go very far. The success of any country, successful countries across the globe, have to a larger extent anchored their success on the quality of education as well as the ability to ensure that their own graduates also live a happy and healthy life. And I think that's the reason that why the ANC had said that these must be the apex priorities as well in our own context in our country. And of course, people would know, many people will agree with me that there is inherently a dialectic link between a highly educated and healthy nation. The two constitute a cornerstone of societal development. And I want to borrow from the outstanding Russian revolutionary, Vladimir Lenin, when he addressed the question of learning and knowledge acquisition in one of his speeches in 1918. And among others, he said, and I quote, education is one of the component parts of the struggle we are waging. Using education, we can counter hypocrisy and lies with the complete and honest truth. He went further and said, and I quote, the working people are thirsting for knowledge because they need it to win. They have realized that knowledge is a weapon in the struggle for emancipation. That their failures are due to lack of education. I think it's important that we must familiarize ourselves with the thrust and the essence of this quotation from Lenin. And let me also make few remarks about the state of our health system in our country, which is obviously, as I said, part of what the leadership of SASCO from Khulekani Mhlongo branch had requested me to comment on. Firstly, let me say briefly, the arrival of the settlers in this country in 1652, in obviously the land that belonged and occupied by the Khoikhoi and the San, who were the indigenous people that had substantial knowledge of what was called at the time the home medicine. The arrival of the settlers in this country, who stayed here for more than a century, and I suppose to a larger extent, depending on what was at the time the indigenous substantive knowledge about what needs to be done to deal with matters of health, stayed in this country for more than a century up until they were able, for the first time, to build what was called one of the medical centers of the time, and probably for our own sake and because in our own modern time that would have been called a clinic or an hospital. The first of those, in terms of the record that is at our disposal, was only done in 1755, while in essence the settlers had arrived in this country in 1652. I think the question that has to be posed, how were they surviving? Because it is inevitable that during that period of more than a century, they would have been confronted by different kinds of ailments and different kinds of difficulties, as a consequence of which they would have depended on one form or one kind of medicine or medication. But it was up until 1755 that they were able to construct a medical center or a health institution, which could be a clinic or a hospital in terms of our current experience. And that was also done. They did that in 1755 in response to a difficult outbreak of a smallpox epidemic. But the coexistence between the African and Western medicine at the time continues without difficulties. And I will explain later on the significance of this coexistence and what then subsequently happened and later also corrected by the National Liberation Movement. Now, the first wave of the legislation, the first wave of a process of enacting some law which regulate health in our country, in terms of actually began in and around 1807. From that period, there was then a systemic assault to the indigenous health knowledge system in our country. That offensive was sustained throughout colonialism and apartheid years, a period that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, spanning more than 350 years. Of course, on the eve of the democratic transition, the ANC developed a concrete, what was then called a national health plan, intended to address two fundamentals: social injustice as well as equality in the health sector. It's a matter of fact that the imbalances in the health system created a situation where most part of our population enjoys less resources compared to what has been historically and still remains a challenge today allocated to the minority who are able to afford private health care. This is a reality that was inherited by the democratic state. Hence, we are still today even talking about 16% of the population enjoying 2 times more the 84% of the population in our country in terms of the resource allocation as well as the quality of health services that is provided by our private clinic and private hospital. However, let me hasten to say that the democratic state has since introduced specific measures which were and are intended to address this historic imbalance, which has obviously lasted for more than 3.5 centuries. One of the interventions that today we recognize, and of course we should celebrate, is the fact that there has been a reintegration of traditional medicine and a clearly defined role of the traditional healers in the context of our health system in this country. This is fundamentally important because, as I said earlier on, the settlers arrived in this country. They stayed here for more than a century, found people who were in existence here, the Khoikhoi and the Sens, who had lived for many, many centuries before and had survived many difficulties without any sort of anything that was called at the time, as we would say today, the Western medicine, or the Western type of the health system that is now dominant in our world. So the reintegration of the traditional medicine, of course, we should appreciate that it is not just going to be about a reintegration. It's also about an ongoing research and inquiry, constantly and consistently to improve the traditional medicine so that it continues to play a role that it has done for many centuries ago. The second intervention that the government has done, of course, is that the government has made an extra effort to attract suitable and appropriate skills of healthcare workers and to work even in deep rural areas and to ensure that they are provided with some dispensation, some incentives for accepting that they can be deployed, they can be employed to go and work in deep rural areas where the level of development has not yet reached a level that is desirable and being pursued by the democratic state. And I think that is a very, very important intervention which we must applaud the government for having done, because it allows a possibility to ensure that many of our people who are in rural areas, the majority of our people are living in conditions that are very far, in places very far away from the townships, the towns and the cities, and therefore have the possibility at the place where they live excuse, to also obtain a quality medical assistance and health care. The third, of course, is that there's a substantial increase on the number of clinics built closer to where people live in order to focus on what is called the primary health care. And I think that is also something that is worthwhile and is worth recognized as an important intervention as part of an ongoing change and a transformation of our country. The fourth one, of course, is the introduction of the National Health Insurance, the NHI, which is intended to improve access to quality health care for all our people. Now, this is very, very important, not just as an ideological disposition, but it's important that all of us, those who are privileged and those who are not, must internalize and accept the fact that there is a need for our country to integrate our health system to ensure that we overcome the current challenges. You see, there is a very, very strange situation that at times occurs in many parts of our country today, which I believe that the NHI would resolve. That if you happen to be unwell, you fell ill, you become very, very critical, or else you are involved in an accident of one form or another, instead of ambulances taking you to a nearby hospital, which may be a private hospital, they will then decide to take you to a further away medical center, whether a hospital or a clinic, which is public. Of course, presuming that you do not qualify or you do not have the means necessary for you to pay for the medical bill in a private hospital. Now, to a larger extent, that has got very, very bad implications, dire consequences for our people who are denied an immediate medical attention and medical care at the nearest available public health institutions or an hospital. And I think that is a major challenge. That's a question that I think the NHI is, of course, going to help us to resolve and address once and for all, so that there is a seamless integration of our health system, and that all of us, black and white, poor and rich, have the possibility to access healthy, quality health care in our country, in order to ensure that we truly live in a sense of being part of the same community and part of the same country. The last point that I think is an important intervention, which must be celebrated, is of course that hospitals are being built everywhere. In many parts of our province, I've seen that, and also in our country, as part of aligning the population size with the available hospitals to serve our people. And I think that is quite important. Now, let me conclude by making a few remarks about the tasks of the moment, the overall task of the moment, which of course can be summed up by the resolutions of the 54th National Conference of the African National Congress, which of course, as we all know, reaffirmed the centrality of the national democratic revolution towards the creation of a national democratic society. It's important that we state that. It's important because that is the overall trust that guides the work that is being done by the government of the day, the leadership elected by our people at the moment. The conference adopted five pillars. The first pillar is the state. The second pillar is the economy. The third pillar is organizational work. The fourth pillar is ideological and the battle of ideas, or ideological work as we put it. And of course, the last one is international work. Let me briefly say something about each of these pillars and the extent to which we are succeeding or otherwise in terms of implementing the objectives for which we have agreed upon in the conference. On the state, I think to a larger extent there is a construction of a new society in our country, And there must be a recognition, of course, of the fact that this construction of a new society that we aspire to depend to a larger extent on the central leadership role of the state. By this, what do I mean? I mean that the transformation, of course, that is taking place in our country has to be led. And of course, the state has, to a very larger extent, reflected certain changes in terms of composition and orientation, in terms of the demographics, the issue of gender. There are changes that are quite significant in terms of the composition, as I said, and the orientation of the state in terms of what it's meant to be doing. But I must indicate that there's still a long way to go in terms of creating a developmental state with the capacity to intervene in the economy, with the capacity to provide leadership to all sectors of society, to inspire everybody and everyone, irrespective of their bank balance, to follow the national line and to also ensure that they support national objectives. And I think that is partly what the state has not yet succeeded in doing. And of course, there are also challenges in some instances in terms of the quality of cadres that were deployed in the state, both at a level of administration and at the political level. And of course, that manifests itself in many ways, through acts of corruption, lack of ethics, poor judgment, inability to understand the moment and rise to the occasion in a manner that inspires our people. Those are some of the manifestations of what we usually get subjected to in terms of the failure, the lack of quality, to some extent, and not entirely on the state leadership, both at the level of the political deployees as well as the administration. But also the state is still, to some extent, battling with an important task of defining a national common agenda and mobilize all society behind that agenda. I know that when the country adopted the NDP, the National Development Plan, what was quite interesting, and I think which all of us as South Africans should be proud of, is that here was a plan that of course originated from the governing party, but ultimately got embraced, internalized and accepted by all political formations in our country, irrespective of their ideological disposition. And to a larger extent, the NGOs, the labor movement and all other progressive forces in our country also embrace to larger extent the ideals contained in the NDP. Of course, there are elements of the NDP that the workers will not agree with, the communists will disagree with, and the business people will also have some discomfort with. But what is quite heightening, what is very, very, very interesting and giving hope, is the fact that for the first time since the 1994 democratic breakthrough, as a nation we're able to put on the table that which we can define as a common agenda, with its all multifaceted tasks and responsibility to be performed by all our people and all sectors of society, business, the labor movement, community, ordinary people like myself and everybody else that is involved in the affairs of our country. The last issue about the state that remains a challenge is the organizational and the technical capability of the state. What do I mean by organizational? You see, there are instances where you would expect departments, even within the province where I lead as a provincial secretary of the ANC, where you would expect that there is a seamless integration and coordination between departments within the province. Let me just make a very practical example. You will have instances where the Department of Education will decide that because of the demand, it's imperative that a school must be built in a certain area. But you will discover that there is no clear alignment between the construction of the school, which must be done by the Department of Public Works, acting on the request of the Department of Education, and the construction of the road, which belongs to the Department of Transport, as well as provision of amenities that are necessary for the school to function and for learning and education to happen appropriately. And I think those are some of the things that at an organizational level, there's a greater need, that great deal of work that needs to be done. And I think the introduction by the president of what is called a district development model is intended to deal with this kind of disparities, to ensure that there is a coordinated and seamless integration of our planning and implementation. And I've often said to our deployed cadres in the provincial government and structures of the ANC that unless we are conscious about that, unless we consciously implement the district development model, we will not succeed to have an integrated development in our country, and will continue to be faced by challenges that are otherwise supposed to be the thing of the past. The technical capacity, which is also a capability, which is a challenge in the state. Many of our institutions, which remains a major challenge, you will find that instead of having an internal capacity to provide, for instance, legal assistance, a department will have a legal unit, a municipality will hire a legal person and have a legal unit. But the problem will begin when the municipality or the department is taken to court. It is only then that you will discover that the legal person, the employed legal person, is actually not capable to represent the department or the municipality in court. And that is something that has to be corrected. Any board and every board who is employed as a technical director, as a legal person within the municipality or the department, it's important that that person must qualify and be registered with an appropriate institution, whether that deals with those who are technical directors or the legal fraternity, to ensure that whenever the institution is caught up in the legal battle, you can be able to go to court and represent it. Why do you have a legal unit when you can't represent the institution that has employed you as part of its legal unit? It doesn't make sense. It's a challenge that I'm saying the technical capability of our state has to be improved to deal with some of those obstacles and those challenges I'm talking about. The second pillar of our transformation is, as I said, the ideological struggle. I think at an ideological front, there's of course a lack of ideological awareness and revolutionary consciousness for some of our cadres, and I would not want to make any practical examples. I think many people who are following this discussion will know what I'm referring to, where there is a failure to distinguish between what is right and wrong and what can and cannot be done by those who are in leadership because of the responsibility they have, as I said, as midwives of social transformation. Now, that is a reflection of a declining levels of revolutionary consciousness, because there are things that can be done, that happen, that people get involved in and they do, which cannot be done by those who are revolutionaries because of their revolutionary consciousness. And that is where there is a distinction between, because there is something that can be done by an ordinary person which will not be seen in any way negative or in any way that raises an eyebrows. But once it is done by a supposedly leader of our people in society, it becomes a major challenge. What will prevent that situation, that intended situation, is the level of revolutionary consciousness that is embedded in our cadres who are deployed in the state and those who are leading the movement. Secondly, there is also a challenge in terms of determining and leading the national discourse in terms of ideas, because the purpose of having to provide leadership at an ideological level is that there must be a very, very strong ability to inform the national discourse, to engage in the discussion in our country, and to shape the discourse in the best interest of the national democratic revolution, not to be in a situation where we can easily be sidetracked by anything and everything that happens in society, as a consequence of which we get deflected and defocused from the strategic task that we're supposed to be pursuing. So once the movement lacks the ability to keep the ideological discourse on track, it becomes a major challenge. And I think that is the reason why, which is my last point on the ideological front, the question of a decade of a cadre remains a perennial challenge that still needs to be attended to. The fourth one is the question of organizational renewal, which is organizational renewal of our movement, which is a major challenge. The battle between the forces that are seeking to conserve the status quo and those that are pursuing change. In many instances, when I have engagement with our comrades, particularly the leadership of our branch executive committees, ordinary members of the ANC, I always made reference to the fact that we will not succeed to renew our movement if we do not succeed to defeat those internally within our organization who are hell-bent and determined to conserve the status quo and therefore are opposed to the renewal of our organization. Because it's inevitable that when the ANC is renewed, the renewed African National Congress will be more alerted, more agile, more informed, will also have within it capable comrades and cadres with a clear ability to distinguish between what is right and wrong. And inevitably, when that happens, there are many people who probably maybe are elected or will be elected in future who cannot make it when the ANC membership, the activists and the cadreship have developed to a level where they have a full appreciation of what is it that is in the best interest of the movement, who qualifies to lead them, who is leading a life, both private and public, that reflect and exhibits the best attributes of the National Democratic Revolution. And I think that is a question that we have to deal with. As a consequence of our failure to succeed in the renewal of the African National Congress, we are also, in the movement as a whole, not just the ANC, but the national liberation as a whole, you will then have a situation where we are consumed by what I call internal strife and battles for control of the party. And this is not a unique challenge facing the ANC. You'll find it in the Communist Party, you'll find it in the labor movement, you'll find it in the civic movement, you'll find it in the student movement, where there is a gradual replacement of quality in terms of what is supposed to be at the leadership echelons of our movement with a populist ascendance of those who have not really been schooled in the tradition and the revolutionary culture of our movement. And I think that becomes a major challenge that then leads to a situation where our people get consumed and surrender themselves into the battles for control, factions, factionalism, and the strive for on who can be deployed and cannot be deployed into the state or the state organs. This also is also showing itself with a declining ability to influence social formations in our country. The NGOs, the sport clubs or sport bodies, as well as the rebellious society and many others. Because when the ANC is in good shape, when the ANC has within it the leadership that is understood to be above reproach and endeavoring each and every time to climb the highest tree, all social formations will always be interested before any move to understand what is the position of the African National Congress. They will be interested to know what is it that the main lead of the National Democratic Revolution think about a particular phenomenon, a particular challenge, or a particular situation before they would be able to ventilate their own suggestion. When that does not happen, when everybody and anybody thinks and believes that they are a leadership and they are leading, it is because the central leadership of the National Democratic Revolution is unable to assert its leadership role, not by force, but by persuasion and a sense of inspiration. I think we need to work very hard, of course, as part of the organizational renewal, to defeat what I classified as the twin enemies of our struggle today, which is an excessive love of money and greed for money. Because in many instances, the challenge that confronts us, many problems that we're confronted with, are as a consequence of comrades wanting to outmaneuver each other in order to ensure that they either get elected or those who are elected will provide the possibility for them to be closer in order to achieve their own sectarian interest, which are fundamentally linked to money and the control of resources. And that is why I think that if we were to really say what are the immediate challenges that confront the movement today, my own view is that among others would be the excessive love of money and greed for money. Of course, under the international fronts, I think the movement is doing relatively well. There has been a resuscitation of the national liberation movements in the continent. Our partnership and what we are trying to forge and work with the BRICS countries is also indicative of our own commitment to ensure that the forces that are loyal to the agenda that we are pursuing are also coordinated and work together for purposes of a better continent and a better world. Let me therefore conclude by saying that if we were to honor Chris Hani, which I think while we were having this interaction on the basis of reflecting on free, quality and free, compulsory and quality education as well as our health system, but what is it that, in my own view, is important for us if we're to truly honor and live into the legacy of Chris Hani? And as I was going through preparing for this note yesterday, there are just a few points which are my last comments on this issue that I want to borrow from the address that was made by the then president of the ANC, President A.P. Xuma. President A.P. Xuma has said something more than 50 years ago, which lives on today, which I think that if we are to do it, we will then be able to honor, and not just to honor, but internalize and immortalize our beloved Martin Tembisile Hani. The first thing that President Xuma said is that for Congress we must be loyal and true. The second thing is that for Congress we must forget any personal and sectarian interest. And I think probably reflecting to the first one, it's important for all of us who belong to the Congress movement, to answer the question as to whether or not we are still loyal and true to the Congress. And to link that question to the second task that President Xuma said for us, when he says that for Congress we must forget any personal and sectarian interest. To what extent today are we able to rise above, suppress, and surrender our own immediate personal interest to the overall cause of the movement and our people? I think that becomes a fundamental issue that we must learn and we must pursue. The third point that was made by President Xuma was that we must put the cause and the interest of our people before any personal expedience. How many of us today, for instance, are prepared to stand back even when there's a possibility to be elected if that has got negative implications to the very same vehicle that must lead our people to a national democratic society? To what extent are we willing to subject our own immediate and personal expedience to the cause of the movement? He went on and said, leadership means service for and not domination over others. How many of us are servicing our people and not dominating them? A few weeks ago, I had an opportunity to talk to the ANC councillors and activists when I attended a meeting in Gwanongoma, under Mzala Nxumalo region. One of the things that I raised, which constantly I've been raising with many of our comrades, is that part of the problem is that once comrades become public representatives or they become councillors, and here there's an opportunity, the municipality is going to pursue a certain development within your ward. And that development will inevitably ensure that a number of people are employed. Instead of an ANC loyal member and activist and a council convening a meeting of the ANC structures and all our people in that area representing various organs of that society and say to them, we're going to have a construction of the road. That construction of the road will, among other things, ensure that job opportunities are created for 20 people or 30 people. What is it that we do what is it that we can do together as this community of this ward to ensure that the selection of those who are going to be employed, the 20 people who will be employed as a consequence of that development of the street, are chosen from the most needy and the poor of the poorest in that area. Many of our structures are unable to do that, and that is why you will then discover later on that people are rebelling, they are fighting against, it would appear in public that they are opposing their own development taking place in their own area. And when you go closer, you recognize, you discover that it is not necessarily an opposition to the development in the area, but it's an opposition to the manner in which opportunities created by that development were dispensed functionally as a source of patronage with an intention to build an empire of a particular comrade or a particular council. Of course, not all councillors are behaving in that way, but some of them are doing that, and that is why then you'll have a huge upheaval, a huge public protest, a huge discontent in a particular area against the public representatives, against their own representative, primarily because a person has grown too big to represent the same community. I think the question that was raised by President Kluma is fundamental. The one of ensuring that we surrender our own personal expedience to the overall cause of our people. And that leadership means service for and not domination to others. The last 2 points that I want to mention that were said by President Kluma is that true and genuine leaders serve the cause of the people and do not expect the cause to serve them or become a source of profit and honor for them. The very last one is that Africa expects her sons and daughters to serve the cause of the people loyally, sincerely, and honestly. In my own view, if we were to take the 6 or 7 points that were articulated by President Kluma more than 50 years ago and live according to that as cadres of our movement, firstly, we will succeed to unite the movement. Secondly, we will move faster. We will move faster in terms of advancing development of our country. But thirdly, we will inspire hope. We will give confidence to the great masses of our people that we know where we want to go, and therefore they will have a voluntary obligation to follow us because they understand where we want to take them. Thank you very much. I think this was a brief interaction that, as I said, was as a result of the leadership of SASCO from Khulekani Mhlongo branch, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and I hope that I have made it possible for many of our comrades who have been following this conversation to learn something and to be able, once again, to interact, to correct some of the assertions, because all of us can only be better when we learn from one another and we're able to engage to improve our own conditions. Thank you very much. I'm going to briefly remain just to ensure that I can respond to some of the questions that have been raised on the screen. Well, there is a question from Twala, which says that no Pala, may you kindly outline the ANC pillars that distinguish the ANC as a movement from other political parties in Africa, and the globe. Well, I think the first thing that Twala, we have to explain about the reason why the ANC, first and foremost, has been called a movement. Firstly, the formation of the ANC the ANC, when from its inception in 1912, the process that led to the formation of the ANC was a multifaceted societal engagement. Many of our people, traditional leaders, the intelligentsia, the religious leadership, and organs of civil society converge together in order to establish what we today know as the African National Congress. But the ANC has always understood, and of course this is sometimes a challenge as we go along, has always understood that our primary objective is not merely to contest state power and become an electoral party. The electoral platform, the contestation of the state power, is precisely to ensure that we acquire the levers of power in order to advance the agenda of social transformation and build a national democratic society. But we're a liberation movement, we're a national liberation, which means we should not and must not be content with the fact that the state will be able to do anything and everything in order to advance the cause of our people. The National Liberation Movement, for instance, does not disengage from the mobilization of society towards the attainment of its vision. The National Liberation Movement ensures that there is a constant mobilization of progressive forces across the country and the globe to work towards the attainment of a common agenda. The National Liberation Movement also does not have to work on the basis of only wanting to ascend to political power. It must always see political power as one of the responsibilities it has in order to advance the ideals of the national democratic revolution. But it doesn't mean that without state power, the National Liberation Movement ceases to exist. It must exist because it has a responsibility to mobilize society beyond the work that can be done by the state and state apparatus. I think that is the extent to which I can deal with the question raised by Twala. Well, Comrade Sendiko Rakorote is raising a question. Among other things, he says that Khulekani advocated for free and compulsory education. The movement has been silent on compulsory education. Those who receive assistance of free education and consciously drop out without completing their duties, their studies, are not frowned upon. Will you support a policy proposal for compulsory education from grade R to matric? Will you support a policy proposal that those who are given assistance of free education and consciously drop out with no convincing reasons be charged with wasteful expenditure and the law takes its course? Well, I think firstly, I think it's important that we must emphasize the centrality of education, as I said earlier on, which obviously represented to a larger extent the ideals and the vision for which Comrade Khulekani stood for. I am also very opposed to a situation where people who have a possibility to pursue their studies decide to drop out because of lack of commitment and because of ensuring that they apply themselves effectively to the imperative of education. I have a problem with that, and I think I can, to a larger extent, be amenable to the question that says there should be certain sanctions, a certain sanction imposed on those who are deciding without valid reasons not to go to school. And I think if really we were to ensure that South Africa becomes a great nation, we must all accept and internalize the fact that the great nation can only be built on the ashes of a successful education system. And I think it's going to be important that within the movement as well, we begin a discussion about enforcing compulsory education. It's a necessary thing that we need to do, not only because it will ensure that we have a huge pool of skills to draw from in order to grow our economy, but as I said, education makes a person to be able to make determinations that are informed not by superstitions, but by scientific acquisition of knowledge and the understanding of what and the distinction of what is right and wrong. So I think it's going to be very, very important that we work very hard to ensure that something is done to inculcate the culture of education and ensure that those who deviate face certain consequences. Well, Ayanda Troublesome Skali, who obviously is the branch secretary of the Khulekani Mhlongo branch, says that I think it's important to further contextualize the type of free education, not only monetary terms, but also regarding decolonization, freeing knowledge production from the chains of capitalism. Equally, the same applies with quality healthcare as it remains capitalist oriented, especially during these trying times. What is your take, Nopal? I mean, Comrade Zekali, Comrade Ayanda, I agree with you. That is why earlier on I made reference to the fact that universities, as well as TVET colleges, should not only understand their responsibilities as merely to produce graduates and therefore get more funding, both from the state and private donors, on the basis that they are able to produce many PhDs as well as many master's graduates. The fundamental question that has to be answered, which is linked to the point that we are raising about decolonization of education, is the extent to which they understand themselves not only to be microcosm of society, but also to have a strategic role consistently to contribute to the well-being and the development of society where they are located. I think the question of decolonizing, because the reason why the system was colonialized, the orientation of colonialism, was that these institutions are merely there for their own sake. They are merely there and sustain their relevance to the extent to which there are graduates going out of those universities without necessarily engaging practically in providing solutions to societal problems in the localities where they are, in the provinces where they are built and located. So I think I agree with you that a great deal of work needs to be done in that direction. And then Comrade Max Kamangete says, he says that can the PS touch a bit on how he viewed FMF as a former student and a student leader himself, and the impact thereof on the moment and how it relates to historical struggles. Can we have a view? Can we have a view from the PS on the calls for the decolonization of the curriculum content for education? Well, I'm not sure if I properly understand what is meant by the FMF. If Comrade Max can clarify that. But the question around the decolonization of higher education is precisely what I was raising with Comrade Ayanda. It's important. It's important in the sense that we have to pose a question that says, to what extent does, for instance, the University of KwaZulu-Natal produces graduates with the requisite skills needed by the primal focus of the economy of KwaZulu-Natal? What is the relationship between what the university produces and what the economy requires in the context of what the province of KwaZulu-Natal focuses on over the next few years? I think there's a disparities there, there's a disjuncture, there's a challenge that needs to be confronted, because in a normal environment and under normal circumstances, what universities are producing should be informed and determined by the immediate imperatives of the society within which they are located. And I think that is where the question of decolonizing education and the role that must be played by universities and TVET colleges must be located. Comrade 17, Comrade Silo, says that what can be the contribution of the Alliance towards the ANC renewal program of action? Well, Comrade Silo, fundamentally, the renewal of the ANC, it's not essentially and exclusively the renewal of the ANC alone. It's a renewal of the mass democratic movement as a whole. At a level of the student leadership, for instance, the question that will have to be answered, what are the things that have made some of our student population, some of our students in various TVET colleges and universities, desert SASCO and join reactional forces? What is it that has inspired that kind of movement? And my own view will be that it will not be because those reactional forces have been able to provide a superior logic in the resolution of the current challenges in universities, but it is because of the recognition and the feeling that the progressive student movement is unable to renew itself sufficiently in order to respond to the demands of the day, and remains and reposition itself as it used to be, as an inspiration and as a dependable ally for the student population. So this question of the renewal applies in different contexts. The ANC has to undertake its own renewal. The Communist Party has to do it. The Labour movement and the student movement also have to pursue the question of the renewal in order for the entirety of the liberation movement to succeed. Comrade Pumlani Makubane says that on the role of universities on research output, providing solution to socio-economic challenges and confronting society, can their effectiveness and ineffectiveness be attributed to funding or curriculum? I'm posing this question with an appreciation of the minute played by SA institutions in the development of COVID-19 vaccine and cure. How can we ensure that our institutions are leading research, providing solutions to the world? Well, of course, I have to confess, Comrade Makubane, that in some instances, our institutions of higher learning have emerged very, very decisively to provide answers to difficulties that are facing our people. However, the point that must be emphasized is that in my own view, they have not been able to do that optimally and consistent with their own ability to ensure that they provide services to the great masses of our people in our country. So yes, the question of funding is another factor. The question, but also there are questions that will have to be posed and answered. What is the style of management that permeates and prevails in many of our institutions in this country? What is their focus and orientation? Are they societally orientated, or they see knowledge production and reproduction as an abstract exercise which can only be important to the extent to which they produce graduates, irrespective of whether those graduates have the means and the ability to solve ongoing societal issues? I think for me, that is a question and a challenge that I think many of our academic institutions will have to be posing and will have to delve on. But I'm very convinced that to the extent that they are contributing, there's a great deal of work they can do, which they need to be always challenged and always persuaded to ensure that they implement. Comrade Tando Isaiah Mavi says that what is your take about NDP 2030, particularly in education and healthcare? Well, Mavi, I look, the NDP is not just a well-written document and a vision of our country, but it truly encapsulates the fundamentals of what needs to be done if we are to succeed to build a prosperous society. So what it says in terms of the NDP and the kind of education that is provided to our people, I fully support it. I believe in it, and I think that the sooner we ensure that the whole country focuses on that direction, it will be possible for us even to attain some of the strategic objectives contained in the NDP long before the actual date of the 2030 as indicated. I think for now I've dealt with some of the questions that were posed. Well, lastly, I think let me, as I said earlier on, let me thank everybody who has had an opportunity to participate in this conversation. I know I have not been able to respond to all comments and questions, and I will follow them up on my Facebook just to ensure that I familiarize myself with some of the comments. But I must say that, of course, we must emphasize the message, the central message about the need for all of us to stay at home, the need for all of us to constantly wash our hands, the need for all of us to ensure that we protect others and protect ourselves, to ensure that we work together to combat and defeat the scourge of COVID-19, and of course to ensure that we who have voluntarily chosen the path of being at the cutting edge of the transformation of our society, truly live up to the expectation of those who are entrusted with the responsibility to be the midwives of social transformation. I think and I believe and I'm very convinced that if we were to succeed to do, even if 3 of the things that I mentioned were very instructive from President Zuma in the early 50s, we will go somewhere. So I wish to thank everybody who has been part of this conversation, everybody within our province in KwaZulu-Natal, eThekwini region, and all other regions, the rest of our country, in all our provinces, those who participated and elsewhere in the world. Thank you very much. I hope that out of this conversation, you did learn something, and I too, I can say without any hesitation that I learned a great deal from the comments, the questions, and everything that was said during the course of this engagement. Thank you very much.